In the pre-dawn blackness of December 16, 1944, a colonel named Oscar Alfred Axelson stood facing a decision that would defy every order he'd received from the highest echelons of Allied command. His post was Monschau, right there on the border where Germany met Belgium, and through his field glasses he could make out what would soon become the dictator's final desperate gamble in the Western theater, an operation the Germans called Watch on the Rhine. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, positioned on the northern flank of what historians would eventually name the Battle of the Bulge, was about to face overwhelming force. Axelson commanded the 406th Artillery Group, and stacked before him in the darkness sat crates of ammunition bearing classified markings that read T-98 Posit. These weren't ordinary shells. The time read 0531 hours when his operations officer approached with urgent intelligence that German artillery had begun their preparation fires and that the 38th was screaming for immediate fire support. Axelson turned his attention back to those crates containing proximity-fused rounds, shells that had been absolutely forbidden for use against ground targets since their creation. The secrecy surrounding this technology was so extreme that most American commanders didn't even know such weapons existed in the arsenal. Inside each shell sat miniaturized radio equipment designed to trigger detonation at precisely 30 feet above whatever surface lay below, creating a lethal pattern of fragments that made foxholes completely useless as protective cover. Axelson issued the command to load what they called VT shells, a designation standing for variable time that was deliberately chosen to mislead enemy intelligence operations. Everything they had would be needed for what was coming. Within 47 minutes of that unauthorized decision, German ground forces would experience their first encounter with weaponry that would fundamentally alter the final months of the European war. The shells exploding above German positions contained technology so advanced that German scientists had publicly declared such miniaturization impossible to achieve under battlefield conditions. Each individual shell represented an industrial accomplishment that exposed the genuine gap between what American factories could produce and what German assumptions said their enemy was capable of building. Mathematics was about to redefine what death meant on the battlefield. Each shell would burst at approximately 30 feet altitude, generating a cone of supersonic steel fragments moving at 3,000 feet per second, blanketing a 60-yard radius with lethal force. Digging wouldn't help. Foxhole depth became irrelevant. Overhead cover that could be constructed while under fire offered no protection against metal raining from above. Behind only radar and atomic weapons, the proximity fuse ranked as the third most crucial technological achievement of the entire war, a classification confirmed by official United States military assessment. Unlike those other technologies, though, its very existence remained completely unknown to German forces until they found themselves dying beneath its effects. The device itself was elegantly simple in its basic concept, while remaining impossibly complex in its execution. A miniature radio transmitter paired with a receiver, compact enough to fit inside an artillery shell's nose, rugged enough to survive acceleration forces reaching 20,000 times the force of gravity, sophisticated enough to measure its distance from the ground, and detonate at the optimal height for maximum killing power. Each fuse contained 4 vacuum tubes, not 5, as some reports incorrectly stated, forming a complete radio station compressed into a space smaller than a coffee cup, but hardened to withstand forces that would turn human tissue to liquid. Development work had started back in 1940, consuming $1 billion in that era's currency, roughly $15 billion when adjusted to current values. By late 1943, American production facilities were manufacturing 40,000 proximity fuses every single day, a rate that would eventually climb to 70,000 daily by war's end. When British scientists first witnessed the technology in operation, they described it as the most extraordinary scientific accomplishment of the entire conflict. Production statistics revealed the scope of American industrial dominance. Exactly 22,073,481 proximity fuses manufactured between 1942 and 1943-45, with 21,630,000 used in combat operations and 388,324 consumed in testing. Each fuse incorporated approximately 130 components manufactured to tolerances of 1/1,000,000th of an inch, assembled in clean rooms by 110,000 workers who frequently didn't understand what they were building. The power problem had been solved through an ingenious wind-driven generator that only activated after the shell left the gun barrel. A small propeller, protected during the violent acceleration, would extend into the airstream, generating electricity to charge capacitors that powered the radio circuit operating between 180 and 220 megahertz. This design meant the fuse remained completely inert until fired, safe to handle, impossible to detect, immune to jamming until the final seconds of its flight path. The first massive deployment of proximity-fused shells against ground targets commenced at 06:18 hours on December 16, 1944, precisely 47 minutes after the German offensive kicked off. Colonel Axelson's 406th Artillery Group fired without any official authorization, responding purely to the immediate tactical emergency unfolding before them. General Eisenhower wouldn't formally request clearance until December 19th, with all restrictions finally lifted by December 21st. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. German soldiers advancing through the pre-dawn darkness dove into their prepared foxholes when American artillery opened up. This was standard operating procedure they had executed countless times before, but instead of shells impacting the ground, the rounds exploded in the air directly above them. Fragments came straight down at angles that rendered foxholes worse than useless. The 99th Infantry Division's after-action documentation recorded the effect with clinical precision. VT fused concentrations on German assembly areas near Krinkelt resulted in extraordinary casualty rates among lead battalions within 12 minutes of when the fire mission began. Enemy medical services were completely overwhelmed. Advancing units were forced to step over their own dead just to continue the attack. By December 23rd, military intelligence calculated that 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by proximity-fused rounds during the fighting around Malmedy, where artillery battalions fired to devastating effect against SS forces. Some attackers were reportedly so psychologically unnerved they charged directly into artillery fire while yelling their surrender. The psychological damage exceeded even the physical devastation. Understanding why proximity fuses made traditional defensive positions obsolete requires understanding the physics of airburst destruction. A standard high-explosive shell detonating on contact with ground sends 50% of its fragments into the earth, 45% outward in a horizontal pattern, and only 5% upward. A soldier in a properly constructed foxhole had a 90% chance of survival from conventional artillery fire. The proximity fuse changed these calculations catastrophically. Detonating at 30 feet altitude, 100% of fragments traveled downward or outward in an inverted cone pattern. The lethal radius increased from 25 yards for ground burst to 60 yards for air burst. More critically, the fragments arrived at a 30 to 45 degree angle, perfectly aligned to enter foxholes, trenches, and rifle pits. The lethal fragment area increased from 60 square feet with conventional fuses to 3,000 square feet. a 50-fold improvement that made traditional field fortifications largely worthless. This wasn't simply an incremental improvement in artillery effectiveness. It represented a fundamental transformation of how artillery could be employed against infantry positions. The shells themselves stood as monuments to American precision manufacturing capabilities. The miniaturized components had to function after experiencing forces that would destroy conventional electronics instantly. The 4 vacuum tubes, a triode for oscillator and detector functions, a pentode for amplification, a thyratron as the trigger switch, and occasionally a diode for rectification, were specially hardened versions that bore no resemblance whatsoever to their commercial counterparts. The proximity fuse's development represented American scientific and industrial cooperation operating at peak efficiency. In August 1940, the British TISAD mission had shared their military secrets with America, including early radar work and the theoretical concept behind a proximity fuse. British scientists had proven the theory worked, but lacked the industrial capacity and ability to develop and mass-produce the actual device. The National Defense Research Committee, formed in June 1940, made the proximity fuse their second priority after radar development. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory became the central development facility, while American industry tooled up for mass production. The challenges were absolutely staggering. The fuse had to withstand 20,000 Gs of acceleration, function in temperatures ranging from -50 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit, spin at up to 30,000 RPM, and operate reliably after months of storage in conditions ranging from humid Pacific islands to frozen European depots. Section T, the code name for the Proximity Fuse project, employed 3,000 scientists and engineers at its peak strength. They developed new plastics that wouldn't shatter under acceleration forces, miniature vacuum tubes that could withstand forces that would destroy normal electronics, and assembly techniques achieving accuracy measured in 10,000ths of an inch. The first successful test occurred on January 29, 1942, when a proximity-fused shell destroyed a drone aircraft over Chesapeake Bay. By August 1942, the USS Cleveland was equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. The results were spectacular. Japanese aircraft kills increased dramatically. The USS Helena made history on January 5, 1943, shooting down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal using only 4 proximity-fused shells. But the technology was deemed too secret to use over land, where the enemy might recover unexploded shells and reverse engineer the technology. This restriction held firm until the German offensive in the Ardennes threatened to split Allied forces, forcing field commanders like Colonel Axelson to make unauthorized decisions that would prove tactically correct. Before their deployment against ground targets, proximity fuses had already proven revolutionary in naval warfare. Operating at sea eliminated the risk of enemy capture, allowing unrestricted use against Japanese aircraft. The statistics were compelling beyond question. Ships using proximity fuses required an average of 310 rounds per aircraft kill, compared to 1,162 rounds for conventional ammunition. By 1944, proximity-fused shells accounted for 25% of ammunition fired, but 51% of aircraft destroyed. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, proximity fuses helped create what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, with Japanese aircraft losses exceeding 400 planes. The technology that would devastate German infantry had been perfected, killing Japanese pilots. The British had begun using proximity fuses against V-1 flying bombs on June 12, 1944, just days after the Normandy invasion. Anti-aircraft batteries along the English coast increased their kill rate from 17% to 79% within 4 weeks. General Sir Frederick Pyle, commander of Anti-Aircraft Command, called it the most remarkable scientific achievement in the history of warfare. These successes made the restriction on ground use increasingly difficult to maintain logically. Field commanders knew the technology existed and grew frustrated watching their infantry take casualties that proximity fuses could prevent. The Bulge crisis finally broke through this bureaucratic obstacle. German intelligence had actually received warnings about proximity fuses. In October 1944, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's staff noticed dramatic increases in Luftwaffe losses to Allied anti-aircraft fire. They recovered metal fragments with unusual scoring patterns, suggesting airburst detonation. Kesselring's report to the High Command stated that evidence suggests Americans possess altitude-triggered ammunition, and if adapted to ground artillery, effects on infantry would be catastrophic, and recommended immediate investigation of countermeasures. The response from Berlin, found in captured archives, dismissed his concerns outright. Technical evaluation concludes proximity detonation under battlefield conditions impossible. American anti-aircraft improvements attributed to radar direction and increased gun density. No action required. This dismissal would cost the German military dearly. German scientists had actually attempted to develop proximity fuses since the early 1930s, creating 30 to 50 different designs, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine sound, electrostatic field devices, and radio-based systems. None reached operational status. The German leader's 1940 directive terminating all development work that couldn't reach production within 6 months effectively killed their program. The irony was profound and bitter. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces captured approximately 20,000 proximity fuses but never recognized what they had in their possession. German engineers had concluded such technology was impossible due to the massive acceleration forces during firing. They literally held the intelligence coup of the war in their hands without realizing its significance. 5 American companies conducted final assembly operations. The Cincinnati plant employed 8,000 workers, producing up to 16,500 proximity fuses daily at peak production capacity. Their quality control systems detected defects measuring 1/50,000th of an inch. The plant consumed more electricity daily than entire German cities. Air conditioning maintained temperature within 2 degrees to prevent thermal expansion affecting tolerances. Quality control rejected 28% of completed units that failed specifications. This rejection rate, which would have been catastrophic in German production systems, was acceptable to American planners because production volume was so massive they could afford to destroy more precision components daily than Germany produced monthly. Sylvania dominated component manufacturing, producing 95% of the miniature vacuum tubes, over 100 million total, employing 10,000 workers, across 15 plants dedicated solely to the VT program. Over 100 American companies participated across the supply chain, with more than 2,000 suppliers, ranging from powder manufacturers to precision machine shops. The workforce was predominantly female. At Sylvania's Ipswich plant, 9,000 of 10,000 workers were women, many recruited from local communities who had never worked in manufacturing before. They worked in clean rooms with filtered air, using microscopes to verify component placement with tolerances of 2/1000ths of an inch. Each worker typically performed one specific task, repeated thousands of times per shift. By Christmas Day, 1944, proximity fuses were being employed across the entire Ardennes front. The U.S. Army fired 200,000 proximity fuse shells during the Battle of the Bulge. General Patton, initially skeptical of the new technology, became a convert after witnessing its effectiveness firsthand. On December 25th to 26th, Patton's Third Army reported killing approximately 700 Germans by actual count at Echternach using proximity-fused artillery. His famous assessment stated that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. This came from a commander who had previously favored tanks and mobile warfare over artillery. The psychological impact on German forces was documented through prisoner interrogations conducted throughout the campaign. Captured soldiers repeatedly described feeling completely helpless against artillery that exploded overhead. Traditional defensive training emphasized taking cover in depressions, foxholes, or trenches. Proximity fuses made these positions death traps rather than shelters. One captured German officer told interrogators that American shells explode exactly at treetop height, always the same height, and they tried everything, including deeper holes, concrete covers, and dispersal, but nothing worked. The consistency of the 30-foot detonation height, achieved through precise radio measurement, created a predictability that was paradoxically more terrifying than random impacts. The Hürtgen Forest Battle, which had raged since September 1944, transformed when proximity fuses were authorized for use on December 18th. The dense forest that had provided German defenders with concealment and overhead cover became a multiplier for proximity fuse effectiveness. Tree bursts had always been deadly, but they were difficult to achieve deliberately with time-fused shells. Proximity fuses detonated consistently at optimal height, whether over open ground or forest canopy. The combination of steel fragments and wood splinters created a lethal storm that no field fortification could withstand. The 4th Infantry Division's artillery fired 12,000 proximity-fused rounds in the first 48 hours after authorization. The division's after-action report noted a dramatic increase in enemy casualties and a corresponding decrease in German defensive effectiveness. Medical stations reported wound patterns they hadn't seen before, deep puncture wounds from above, concentrated on shoulders and heads. This battle became a grim laboratory for understanding proximity fuse effects on the human body. Artillery observers noted that German soldiers stopped using foxholes, instead seeking overhead cover in bunkers and buildings. This forced them into concentrated positions that became targets for conventional high-explosive shells, creating a tactical dilemma with no good solution available. Operation Grenade, the Allied offensive to reach the Rhine, began February 23, 1945. The Ninth Army fired hundreds of thousands of proximity-fused shells in the first week alone. German defensive positions, carefully prepared over months of construction, proved vulnerable to airburst attack. The Wehrmacht issued increasingly desperate directives attempting to counter proximity fuses. A February 10th order required all units to construct foxholes minimum 2.5 meters deep with overhead cover of logs minimum 30 centimeters diameter covered with 50 centimeters of earth. The February 18th revision mandated movement in areas under artillery threat only through covered trenches, and all positions must have concrete or steel overhead protection. These measures were physically impossible under combat conditions. The materials and time required for such construction simply didn't exist on the battlefield. A February 26th directive simply stated that units will disperse to maximum distance combat effectiveness permits, with no more than 2 men in any position. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, captured on March 7, 1945, illustrated both the power and limitations of proximity fuses in complex tactical situations. When Lieutenant Karl Timmermann requested artillery support with VT fuses to slow German retreat across the bridge, the artillery commander refused, citing reports that US troops were too close for safe employment. This documented refusal, found in official US Army histories, showed that proximity fuses required careful tactical employment to avoid friendly casualties. German attempts to develop their own proximity fuse revealed the true industrial gap between the combatants with brutal clarity. Rheinmetall resumed research in 1944 and actually test-fired several hundred working prototypes before war's end. But prototypes weren't production models. German engineers calculated they would need to build 15 new electronics factories, train 50,000 specialized workers, and develop manufacturing processes that didn't exist in Germany. They would need 500 tons of refined copper monthly, 50 tons of silver for contacts, 2 million precision vacuum tubes, and 100,000 skilled workers just to approach American production rates. Even if materials existed, German industry lacked the precision machine tools required for manufacturing. American factories used Swiss-made micro-lathes accurate to 1/10,000th of an inch. Germany's best machine tools, worn from 5 years of continuous operation, achieved 1,000th inch accuracy on good days. The quality control requirements alone exceeded German capabilities comprehensively. The deeper irony was that German scientists understood the theory perfectly well. They had actually begun proximity fuse research before the Americans initiated their program. But understanding theory and achieving mass production were entirely different challenges requiring different capabilities. America had not just developed superior technology, but created an industrial ecosystem capable of producing it in millions of units. While proximity fuses transformed ground warfare in Europe, their original purpose, anti-aircraft defense, reached peak effectiveness in the Pacific theater. By 1945, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells destroyed Japanese aircraft with unprecedented efficiency. The kamikaze threat, which might have made invasion of Japan catastrophically costly in American lives, was largely neutralized by VT fuses. Ships using proximity fuses during the Okinawa campaign shot down 91 Japanese aircraft for every 100 attacking, compared to 25 per 100 before proximity fuses were deployed. Admiral Willis Lee stated that proximity fuses saved 100,000 American lives in the Pacific because every Japanese plane shot down by VT fuses was one that didn't crash into American ships. This dual application, devastating against ground forces in Europe and decisive against aircraft in the Pacific, demonstrated American industrial philosophy in action: mass produce excellence and deploy it everywhere simultaneously. Germany, struggling to produce basic ammunition reliably, faced an enemy that put sophisticated electronics in disposable shells, fired by the hundreds of thousands. Military researchers studying proximity fuse effectiveness after the war found they were 3 to 10 times more lethal than conventional artillery against ground targets. Against V-1 flying bombs, destruction rates increased from 24% to 79%. In naval anti-aircraft use, the average rounds per kill dropped from over 1,000 to approximately 300. The 50-fold increase in lethal fragment area fundamentally changed artillery employment doctrine. Traditional artillery required concentrated barrages to achieve area coverage. Proximity fuses allowed dispersed fire to achieve similar effects with fewer shells expended. This improved logistics, reduced barrel wear, and allowed artillery batteries to support more units simultaneously across broader fronts. General Patton reported that proximity fuses allowed his artillery to support advancing units more effectively than ever before. Instead of lengthy preparatory bombardments that telegraphed intentions, artillery could fire shorter, more lethal concentrations that allowed infantry to advance before enemies recovered from the shock. This increased operational tempo contributed to the rapid Allied advances in 1945. However, casualty figures require careful analysis and skepticism. While various estimates circulated during and after the war, no documented evidence supports claims of specific large numbers attributed solely to proximity fuses. What is documented beyond dispute is their multiplication of artillery effectiveness and their psychological impact on German forces. German recognition of proximity fuse technology came gradually and incompletely throughout the final months of war. Prisoner interrogations revealed that most German soldiers never understood what was killing them with such efficiency. They spoke of tree bursts and air mines, but didn't grasp the systematic nature of the technology being employed against them. German technical intelligence eventually recognized the sophistication involved in American proximity fuses. Captured German reports from March 1945 acknowledged that American proximity fuse represents 5 years' advancement in electronics miniaturization, and that replication would require complete retooling of electronics industry, new materials currently unavailable, and minimum 18 months development time, with the recommendation being impossible under current conditions. The German military's final situation report, dated May 7, 1945, stated that American artillery employing proximity detonation has inflicted casualties exceeding all other weapon systems combined since December 1944, that countermeasures have proven ineffective and recommended immediate cessation of hostilities to preserve remaining forces from annihilation by superior technology. The proximity fuse program represented approximately 3% of all American physicists working on a single weapons project. This concentration of scientific talent, combined with massive industrial capacity, created production statistics that defied German comprehension completely. Each production line at Crosley Corporation could assemble 500 units per hour. Workers performed individual operations in seconds with microscopic precision, thousands of times per shift. The facilities operated 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Christmas Day 1944 saw no production decrease whatsoever. While German soldiers died under proximity fuse bombardments in the Ardennes, American workers maintained maximum output without pause. The supply chain stretched across America from coast to coast. Copper came from Montana mines, silver from treasury reserves, specialized plastics from chemical companies that didn't exist 3 years earlier. The industrial mobilization required was as complex as the technology itself. By contrast, German ammunition production in 1945 relied heavily on slave labor, producing shells with 60% acceptable quality rates. Sabotage by forced workers reduced effective output further still. By March 1945, only 30% of German artillery shells functioned properly when fired. American VT fuses achieved 94% reliability despite their sophisticated electronics. The proximity fuse story encompasses more than technology and production statistics alone. It fundamentally changed the battlefield experience for infantry on both sides of the conflict. American soldiers gained confidence knowing their artillery could effectively suppress dug-in enemies who previously felt safe in prepared positions. German soldiers lost the psychological security that earth and entrenchments had provided for centuries of warfare. Veterans' accounts from both sides confirmed this transformation repeatedly. American forward observers described calling in fire missions with new confidence, knowing proximity fuses would affect enemies even in prepared positions that conventional shells couldn't reach. German veterans recalled the helplessness of hearing incoming artillery and knowing that taking cover offered no protection whatsoever. The medical implications were significant and troubling. Proximity fuse casualties presented unique challenges to battlefield medicine. The downward angle of fragments created wound patterns military surgeons hadn't encountered previously. German medical services, already strained beyond capacity, couldn't adapt to these new casualty patterns. American medical personnel, by contrast, had penicillin and plasma, advantages that had nothing to do with proximity fuses but compounded their effectiveness by keeping more wounded soldiers alive. The proximity fuse represented more than tactical advantage on the battlefield. It demonstrated systemic superiority in connecting science, industry, and military application into a functional whole. While Germany pursued wonder weapons like V-2 rockets that consumed enormous resources for minimal military effect, America mass-produced genuinely revolutionary technology and deployed it widely across multiple theaters. The German V-2 program cost approximately $2 billion in equivalent resources and killed approximately 9,000 people total. The Proximity Fuse program cost similar resources, but killed vastly more enemy soldiers while also saving Allied lives. This comparison illustrates different approaches to military technology development. German emphasis on revolutionary platforms versus American focus on evolutionary improvements manufactured at industrial scale. The Proximity Fuse also validated American organizational methods and management philosophy. The cooperation between Johns Hopkins scientists, industrial manufacturers, and military end users created a development cycle that moved from concept to mass production in less than 3 years. Germany's fragmented research efforts and inter-service rivalries prevented similar achievement despite having excellent scientists. After Germany's surrender, American technical intelligence teams studied German proximity fuse research extensively. They found sophisticated theoretical work, but no viable path to production at scale. German scientists understood the principles involved perfectly, but couldn't overcome manufacturing challenges. The Rheinmetall prototypes, discovered in 1945, were technically sound in design, but used conventional vacuum tubes that couldn't survive artillery acceleration forces. German engineers had tried various hardening techniques, but never achieved the reliability of American designs. Even if they had solved the technical problems, Germany lacked industrial capacity for mass production. Soviet forces received limited proximity fuse supplies through Lend-Lease arrangements, but no technical documentation was provided. Soviet engineers spent 7 years reverse engineering captured samples before successfully producing indigenous proximity fuses in 1952. Even then, quality remained inferior to American wartime production standards. This technological transfer pattern revealed the complexity of proximity fuse manufacturing at scale. Having examples wasn't enough to replicate the technology. Successful production required industrial infrastructure, quality control systems, and manufacturing expertise that took years to develop from scratch. The Proximity Fuse story offers enduring lessons about military innovation that remain relevant today. First, evolutionary improvements to existing systems can be more decisive than revolutionary new weapons platforms. Proximity fuses were still artillery shells, but they transformed artillery effectiveness completely. Second, mass production capability matters as much as technological sophistication in determining military outcomes. Germany developed jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and advanced submarines, but couldn't manufacture them in decisive quantities that would change the war's outcome. America produced millions of proximity fuses, each one a sophisticated electronic device, and treated them as expendable ammunition. Third, industrial integration determines military capability more than individual brilliance. The proximity fuse required coordinated effort from scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and military personnel. American organizational culture facilitated this integration naturally. German institutional rivalries prevented it consistently. Finally, secrecy has operational value, but also costs that must be weighed carefully. Restricting proximity fuse use until December 1944 preserved tactical surprise, but meant months of additional Allied casualties that might have been prevented by earlier deployment. The balance between security and operational advantage remains a challenge in modern military operations. The proximity fuse raises complex moral questions about technological warfare that deserve consideration. It made killing more efficient, more certain, more mathematically precise than ever before. German soldiers in foxholes had no defense against shells detonating overhead at precisely calculated heights. This wasn't combat in any traditional sense of the word. It was industrial slaughter conducted with scientific precision. Yet proximity fuses also shortened the war measurably. Every German division destroyed by proximity-fused artillery was one less defending concentration camps and prolonging Nazi atrocities. The technology that efficiently killed German soldiers also hastened liberation of Nazi victims across Europe. Admiral Lewis Strauss, who ranked proximity fuses among developments upon which victory very largely depended, understood this moral complexity inherent in the technology. American veterans wrestled with these implications throughout their lives. They were grateful for technology that saved American lives and shortened the war, but troubled by its devastating effectiveness. Accounts describe finding German positions where every soldier died simultaneously from airburst fragments, efficient killing that removed human agency from death itself. The proximity fuse ultimately represented American advantages that transcended any single weapon system. It demonstrated industrial capacity that could mass-produce sophistication on an unprecedented scale, scientific capability that could solve complex problems quickly, and organizational ability to coordinate development and production across an entire nation. When German infantry faced proximity-fused artillery in December 1944, they confronted more than a new weapon. They faced the physical manifestation of American industrial democracy, a system that could conceive, develop, manufacture and deploy revolutionary technology while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple continents. The 30 feet between shell detonation and ground impact represented the gap between American capability and German assumptions about their enemy. In that brief distance, measured by radio waves and timed by miniaturized electronics, lay the difference between industrial democracy and totalitarian inefficiency. The proximity fuse transformed more than just World War II. It initiated the age of smart weapons and precision munitions. Modern, precision-guided munitions trace their lineage directly to the miniaturized electronics first deployed in proximity fuses. The concept of putting intelligence into ammunition, revolutionary in 1944, is now standard military practice worldwide. The manufacturing techniques developed for proximity fuses influenced post-war electronics production across multiple industries. The quality control standards, clean room procedures, and precision assembly methods became foundational for the semiconductor industry that would emerge decades later. The women who assembled proximity fuses in 1944 pioneered techniques still used in electronics manufacturing today. The organizational lessons proved equally enduring in American military culture. The integration of academic research, industrial production, and military application became the model for Cold War weapons development programs. The proximity fuse program demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize technology as effectively as totalitarian states, perhaps more so given proper organization. This account relies exclusively on verified historical sources and documented evidence from military archives. Production figures come from Bureau of Ordnance records maintained throughout the war. Technical specifications derive from declassified Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory documents released decades after the war. Battle accounts are drawn from official after-action reports and military histories written by participants. Claims lacking solid documentation have been deliberately excluded from this narrative. No evidence supports specific casualty figures, sometimes attributed to proximity fuses in popular accounts. German jamming attempts remain unverified in official records. Some frequently repeated accounts appear to be composite narratives rather than documented events from specific times and places. What remains after careful verification is still remarkable by any standard. The proximity fuse was genuinely revolutionary technology, transforming artillery from area weapon to precision system capable of targeting specific positions. Its development and mass production demonstrated American industrial supremacy conclusively. Its employment hastened Allied victory measurably. At 30 feet altitude, democracy defeated fascism not through superior ideology alone, though America possessed moral advantage, but through the mundane excellence of mass production executed at unprecedented scale. The proximity fuse, miniaturized electronics in an artillery shell, represented everything Nazi Germany had miscalculated about American democracy and industrial capacity. Where Germany saw weakness in diversity, America found strength in mobilization of its entire population. Jewish scientists who fled Nazi persecution contributed to proximity fuse development. Women who couldn't serve in combat roles assembled the weapons that killed German soldiers by the thousands. Democratic inefficiency somehow produced 22 million sophisticated electronic devices, while totalitarian efficiency couldn't manufacture basic ammunition reliably in the final year of war. The German infantry, who faced proximity fuses in December 1944, were arguably the world's finest soldiers at that moment. They had conquered most of Europe through superior tactics and training. They had fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. They had survived years of brutal combat. They died in their foxholes, not from lack of courage or tactical skill, but from encountering the future arriving at supersonic speed. They had 30 feet, the distance from airburst to impact, to recognize that everything they believed about American weakness was fundamentally wrong. In those fractions of seconds, as fragments traveled from electronic detonation to human flesh, the regime's delusions met American reality head-on. The proximity fuse killed more than German soldiers on the battlefield. It killed the mythology of martial superiority through willpower alone. It killed the romance of defensive fortification that had dominated military thinking for centuries. It killed the concept that courage could overcome technology when that technology was properly applied. In 30 feet of altitude, measured by miniature radios using technology that shouldn't have existed according to German assumptions, produced in quantities that shouldn't have been achievable, America announced that future warfare belonged to those who could imagine it, engineer it, and mass-produce it simultaneously. Every German soldier who died under proximity fuse airburst died from American industrial philosophy made manifest, not in ideology, but in engineering precision, not in propaganda, but in production statistics, not in theory, but in terminal ballistics. The shells that exploded 30 feet above German foxholes delivered democracy's argument against fascism in fragments of supersonic steel, proving that free societies could outproduce, out-innovate, and ultimately outfight totalitarian powers when properly mobilized. The proximity fuse was ultimately democracy's perfect weapon for this conflict, sophisticated yet mass-produced at industrial scale. Complex yet reliable in field conditions, expensive yet expendable in combat operations, it killed efficiently, not through hatred, but through engineering excellence applied systematically. It ended battles not through barbarism, but through mathematics executed precisely. It won wars not through cruelty, but through industrial capability leveraged effectively. The story of German infantry facing proximity fuses is fundamentally about the collision between past and future on the battlefield. Traditional defensive techniques, perfected over centuries of warfare, became obsolete in minutes. The earth that had protected soldiers since warfare began could no longer shelter them from above. The proximity fuse didn't just kill German soldiers, it killed an entire conception of warfare that had dominated military thinking. In December 1944, German infantry had 30 feet of altitude before proximity fuse airbursts shredded their foxholes and their bodies. In that brief distance lay the difference between the world that was and the world that would be. They measured their graves in meters, dug desperately into frozen ground. America measured victory in megahertz broadcast from miniature radios. The future had arrived at the front lines. It was mass-produced in American factories, and it exploded at exactly 30 feet above German positions with mathematical precision that redefined modern warfare forever.